So if you've been paying attention a little bit, you might have picked up on the idea that we're setting a theme. And that theme happens to be love. And it is a natural theme because we are days away from Valentine's Day. So if I don't see you on Wednesday, I have to be sure and wish everyone a happy Valentine's Day because it is coming up. But it's also fitting for us to kind of kick off this sermon series that I'm going to be focused on for the season of Lent. And we're going to be looking at and studying some about the love of God and God's love and how that fits into our lives. So in the spirit of Valentine's Day, we are kicking this off. Now, Valentine's Day is an unusual holiday. It actually has some Christian history, some Christian heritage. There was a Saint Valentine that the Roman Catholic Church recognized a few years ago. I think it was the year 270. And there have been lots of other people named Valentine that kind of have come and gone. And what's interesting is no one seems to really know how this tradition of honoring love and affection and that sort of thing got linked up with Valentine's Day. I tried to do a little bit of research thinking I'd find a kernel of interest, but it's kind of a mystery. But it is very popular. You might be interested to know that on Valentine's Day there's going to be something like 1 billion Valentine's Day cards exchanged. That is second place only to the exchange of Christmas cards, which is about double that number. But anyway, so there you have Valentine's Day. But as we focus on the love and the affection and all of those things that sort of surround Valentine's Day, and we begin to recognize that the love of God is very different than the kind of love that we celebrate for Valentine's Day. Now, in the English language, we are a little bit limited in terms of all of the descriptive words that we need to adequately describe all of the different kinds of love that there are. And I think most of us are sort of familiar, or we've heard about the Greek word agape that is listed in the New Testament that kind of describes the love of God. And I'm not going to really spend a lot of time chasing that particular idea because I think all of us recognize that the love of God is very different than the love that we experience as human beings. So instead, what we're really going to try to sort out this morning is this idea of the evidence of God's love. And how do we look for that? How do we find that? Where do we look? And knowing that the love is very different, the love of God is uniquely different from the human love that we experience, the evidence is also different. And I think that clarity on this point is crucial to our understanding of both the nature of God and our relationship with God, because we have a tendency to only look for the evidence of God's love in very human ways. And that sometimes can lead us into trouble. That sometimes can really send us down the wrong path. Now, it is a natural thing for us to do that. It's very normal. I'm not offering that as a condemnation by any means, because after all, the only experience of love that we have is a human experience. So what else are we taught? What else are we to know? Where else are we to look? Because the only experience of love that we have is a human experience. Now, you really kind of need to think about this and work through your entire life. But there was a time, believe it or not, that we were all children, like this high. And as children, we experienced the love of a parent. Most of us have good experiences, good memories that we can recall of being under our parents' care and being the recipient of that parental love. And then perhaps we grew a little bit and we got into junior high. Maybe we had a crush on somebody. You know, we had that thing that we call puppy love. And then we get into high school and, you know, maybe we experiment a little bit with dating and we meet other people. And eventually, somewhere along the line, we actually might find somebody that we fall in love with. And we get married. Now, I recognize that not everybody that gets married stays married. Or some of us sometimes are married a second time or a third time. But all of those experiences are still human being to human being. Even those that are in the news right now about the same gender marriages, those are still human being to human being. And then sometimes those marriages produce children. And then we have a love of a whole different kind. You know, where I talked about receiving the parental love, but now, as adults and being married, we are in a position to offer and give that parental love to our children. It seems like it ought to be a rare thing that you want to strangle somebody that you love. But when our three boys were all three teenagers, you know, it happened more times than I'd like to admit. But even in that moment, when you feel like you want to strangle them, you're still expressing this kind of love that is human being to human being. And then life goes on, and your children have children of their own, and all of a sudden we get to experience the joy of being a grandparent. And as grandparents, we love our grandchildren. But it's still a human expression of that love. And so all we have ever known is human expression of love. And it's natural for us to look for God's love in those human terms. It's the only love that we have any experience with. It's the only love that we ever arrive at. But there's a downside to doing that. Because if we look for God's love in human terms, it almost always brings a level of disappointment to us. We can't look around and not see shortcomings in our world. We can't really look around and see the world in its current condition and say to ourselves, oh, God loves that person. When we have people around the globe that are starving, children that are dying because they are malnourished or don't get enough to eat, children that are displaced because of war, and they're refugees, and there's ethnic cleansing going on, and there's human trafficking, and there seems to be all of this pain and suffering, and all of this stuff is going on, and we look to God and we go, what is going on? Because God's love obviously does not extend to a large percentage of the world's population. Because we see these things, and we're confused. How can God love someone and allow them to starve to death? And so we begin to ask questions. We begin to wrestle with this a little bit. And they are hard questions. And there's questions that we don't always want to confront. There's questions that we just assume, just kind of stay quiet about. We don't need to talk about this. Questions like, why does God allow that suffering? Why are people born disfigured or disabled? Why does that happen? Why is there such a thing as ethnic cleansing in certain parts of the world? What's going on with that? How does God allow that? Why is there such a thing as human trafficking? Terrible, awful, horrible stories of things that happen to people all around. And if you ask someone who claims to be an agnostic or an atheist, in my experience, that's the first thing that they point to. They will tell you to your face that the love of God is only in your imagination. that it does not actually exist because of the suffering and the birth defects and the ethnic cleansing and the war and the human trafficking and all of the pain and suffering that goes all around the world. And oftentimes we don't have a good answer for that. And the questions themselves can go on and on and on. There's no end to the questions. So what are we left with? What are we faced with here? How can we experience or identify or find evidence of God's love? Where is it to be found? What do we point to? How can we say that the love of God is real in the midst of our search, in the midst of a human experience? For many of us, the answer to those questions actually gets us into more trouble. The answers that we come up with often fall into two categories. Category number one is God chooses to allow the suffering for reasons that we don't know, reasons that we can't understand, but it's just the way that it is. Category number two is God wants to eliminate the suffering, but for whatever reason cannot. As for category number one, God chooses to allow that kind of suffering. That's not the God that I know. That's not the God that I read about in the New Testament. That's not the God that I'm in relationship with. So I kind of reject category number one. God wants to, but cannot eliminate the suffering. That is a handcuffed, hand-tied, powerless God. And what kind of a God is that? So where do we go from here, right? Well, we begin to rely on cliches then. In response to two questions in those two categories that neither answer seems to work, neither answer seems to fit, we're not really comfortable with how that works, we begin to tell ourselves things like, oh, well, God works in mysterious ways. We tell our things like, oh, you just have to have faith. The one that really bugs me is God will never give you more than you can handle. To answer life's toughest questions with cliches like that is a very dismissive attitude. I mean, I'm sorry, but platitudes like this really don't help. They don't address the real issue. They don't really bring much comfort. They don't truly answer the question about where is God's love. If it were true that God would never give us more than we can handle, then no one would ever commit suicide. I don't know if you know this or not, but Idaho is almost leading the nation in terms of our rate of suicide. And our particular part of Idaho is leading the state in mental illness and suicide rates. So once again, you have another question. Where is the love of God when someone takes their own life? Now, I recognize that these are hard, difficult questions. That these are things that we just don't really like to talk about, we don't like to think about, we just soon sweep them under the rug. Because it challenges our faith. But I'm offering these questions to you to remind you that our human experience of love causes us to equate God's love in human terms. And it is that human experience that causes us to project our humanness onto the divine. We project our humanness onto God. Now, I desperately wish that there were a different word to describe this process of our projecting our humanness onto God. But unfortunately, there is not. And I don't want it to be intimidating. I don't want to sound over-intellectual. I don't want to, have anybody dismiss this idea because they think that it's too big of a word. But what that process is, it's what is called creating an anthropomorphic image of God. And it simply means that we attach human qualities, we attach human identity to God, to the divine. And that is what leads us into those areas and those questions that seem to have no answer. It is that anthropomorphic image of God. It is that searching for the evidence of God's love in human ways. And without us even realizing it, it's so easy to fall into that. Now, without even realizing it, I just did it to you. You remember when I was talking a few minutes ago about these unanswerable questions about, why are there starving children? And why is there such a thing as human trafficking? And why are, wars and ethnic cleansing allowed to go? And I said that there's two categories that those answers fall into. Category number one was God chooses to allow the suffering. Category number two was God wants to change it, but can't. Without even realizing it, I led you into an anthropomorphic vision of what God is. Because the language of God chooses this, or God wants to do that, those are very human emotional responses. In other words, you're at the grocery store and you choose cookies and cream ice cream over Rocky Road. That is an emotional choice. Very good choice, by the way. But that's a very emotional choice. It's a human choice. When you get up in the morning and you've got a full day of outdoor activities, you're going to take a long bike ride and then you're going to have a picnic in the park. And you wake up and it's raining cats and dogs. You want to be able to change the weather, but you can't. It's raining. There's nothing you can do about it. That's a human response. That's an emotional response. You want to, but you cannot do anything about it. Those are anthropomorphic answers to these questions about God's love. And I offered those to you to show you how easily we get kind of led in and drawn into this image of God that becomes an image that is human. Superhuman, to be sure, but human. And just maybe that's not what God is. What does the love of God look like that has no emotion? What does the love of God look like that makes no choices? What does the love of God look like that doesn't say yes or no? I don't know how many times I've heard people, say in prayer, that they're hoping that God says yes, or they're disappointed that God said no. What does the love of God look like that doesn't say yes or no? That doesn't make emotional choices? What does that look like? And how does that work? The image of God that we hold is foundational in our faith. The image of God that we have in our heads is instrumental in determining how the rest of our lives play out and how we honestly and forthrightly deal with these kinds of questions. Because you see, a God that doesn't have an emotional response, a God that doesn't choose, a God that doesn't want to, all of a sudden is dismissed or freed from things like, why is there suffering all over the world? Or why is there war? Or why is there ethnic cleansing? Why are children starving? God neither chooses nor wants to. There is no emotional response. God is not a superhuman. God is something else. And I challenge you to begin to think about what that something else might be. Look beyond your anthropomorphic image of God. Search for something that is deeper, something that is more universal, something that pulsates through all of creation. As I said, this is a topic that we're going to be dealing with for the next few Sundays. But over the next week, I would invite you to watch your language when you begin to talk about God. How many times do you use the word he, or him, or his, or even her? That's anthropomorphic kind of language. How often do you speak in terms of human experience? How often do you say things like, oh, the hand of God was really involved in that? Or I looked up into the clouds and I saw God's face. Yeah, it's everywhere. And it happens to us all the time. But it leads us into places where we end up painting ourselves into a corner and we can't get out. So I think that I've given you enough to think about for today. Stay tuned. The series will continue. But for now, believe me when I say that the love of God is true. The love of God is there. The love of God is available for all of us to experience. But it is not a human experience. It's something much deeper, something more spiritual, something that goes beyond your anthropomorphic image of God. And that's food for thought. Enough for today. Go in peace. Amen.